Okay, great. We'll go ahead and get started as other folks are settling in. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Margot Hall from Ropes & Gray. I'm here with my colleagues Eve Bruntz and Allison Fethke, and we collaborate regularly on behalf of life sciences clients around multiple issues that come up around the commercialization of pharmaceutical products. And last year, we were here and presented on buy and bill and related trends, and immediately afterwards we're sort of anticipating what is going to be the next thing we want to present on next year. And at the time, collectively identified, direct to patient. We're getting a lot of questions around this. We see this as sort of a growing trend. And that all predated everything that's unfolded in 2025, where there's been additional sort of ignition fuel around direct-to-patient models and some really unique facets of the models, both in terms of opportunities and then, unique considerations from a market access and legal perspective. So we're going to walk through that today. I'm going to first provide the standard disclaimer that we are not providing legal advice today, but there are many nuanced questions that do come up around direct-to-patient models, and so recommend that if you are pursuing one or you're considering pursuing one, take into account the multiple potential layers that could be present in any given model. So we'll start off by giving an overview of what is direct-to-patient, walk through recent developments, and some industry exemplars and initiatives, and then get into walking through potential legal and market access considerations. So starting, first of all, this is headlines, top of the fold. Practically every day, I am seeing trade press talk about new developments in thematically what I'll describe as the direct-to-patient space. There also has been a lot of interplay, which we'll talk about today, between most favored nation and direct-to-patient, and a particularly important set of considerations for those of us who work and practice in the government price reporting space, as I know many of us at this conference do. So I'll give an overview of the direct-to-patient term as, starting with the first bullet, kind of implicit in the term direct-to-patient itself. There's a real focus on a manufacturer directly commercializing a product to a patient. Oftentimes, though, manufacturers historically have not actually directly dispensed, let's just say, a drug to a patient. And so notwithstanding the direct-to-patient nomenclature, we'll talk about there typically are intermediaries that do play a role in the overall access of a patient of a given drug. There are legal questions that come up along the way, one being, which is the sale? In a typical direct-to-patient model, in many instances, the sale is direct from the manufacturer to the patient, and there's a lot of intentionality in the agreements and the drafting and legal facets like how does title transfer that become really important for purposes of determining what is a relevant sale for price reporting and other purposes. In many instances, direct-to-patient is outside insurance. It could be viewed as a cash pay model or otherwise. That's the model we're going to focus on here today. I will note that each of these models, and there are many vendors in this space now and more vendors probably by the day, right, that are getting into this space, each model is a little bit different. And so there is no one-size-fits-all direct-to-patient. So we'll discuss, kind of the themes that come up. Another one is the real potential for enhanced efficiencies in the supply chain and reducing the number of supply chain stakeholders. I think certainly where you have direct-to-patient and a patient is opting for cash pay rather than selecting to go through insurance, if that would potentially be available, you can think of certain intermediaries, namely, payers, PBMs, that would not be present, that traditionally very well would be present for many patients within the supply chain. And so a lot of what we've heard discussed is this is really promising in terms of bringing more efficiency to the supply chain, that there are so many layers of complexity. Direct-to-patient is a way to simplify the model. You also, though, have this question around, and as I mentioned before, direct to patient. And I think, the direct term also comes up in the government price reporting exceptions. We'll talk more about that later. As I mentioned before, pretty unusual historically for a pharmaceutical manufacturer to be dispensing a product directly to a patient, right? That typically would be a function of a pharmacy. And so you still have supply chain stakeholders that play an important role, and very important to consider the roles of the different entities and look at each of them fresh and think about the service arrangements, the remuneration, title, transfer, and otherwise, and try to unpack that all, both from a government price reporting perspective, but also from a fraud and abuse perspective, as Eve and Allison will discuss more. Common objectives that you hear around direct-to-patient is really getting closer to the patient, right? Simplifying the experience for the patient as well, potentially achieving lower prices. I mean, I'll say on that point, lower prices aren't sort of a necessary ingredient of any direct-to-patient model. I think from a government price reporting perspective, there is some additional relief that is there if you do pursue direct-to-patient sales and wanted to lower the prices that are made available through that channel. And then some models involve a telehealth component, you know, online access to physicians or pharmacies and other forms of online support. Okay, so we've had recent expansion of the direct-to-patient model. A volume of questions that we've been receiving. As I mentioned, this really predated the Trump administration executive orders, but amplified by recent developments. We also have other trends in the market that are converging at this time. So growing reliance on and acceptance of telehealth as a healthcare model. Certainly the COVID pandemic was sort of another form of fuel for that trend. And then you have an availability of emerging technologies, different vendors, right? Lots of different forms of innovation and creatures that are kind of converging at this moment in time. And at the same moment, we have, we as an industry, speaking on behalf of many of the clients that I work with and me personally, enduring concerns around how patients are able to access pharmaceuticals. And there have been growing number of public reports, policy calls, looking at how patients experience their health coverage, right? Challenges with getting access through a formulary when you're getting your drug through your benefit design, high deductibles and copays, scrutiny about the amount that a patient actually pays out of pocket in a plan and whether or not that might be different from and potentially higher than a cash pay price for the same drug. And then we have the Trump administration focus on direct-to-patient models. So we had the well-known May 2025 executive order. I'll recap it briefly because I know that we have talked about it a bunch and there will be many more panels unpacking this as well. But from my perspective, two key drug pricing provisions. So you had the first that received the most attention, which was directing the HHS secretary to communicate MFN targets to manufacturers, and then directing additional regulatory actions if manufacturers failed to make significant progress towards MFN pricing for American patients. And I emphasize that, the text within that executive order is seemingly focused on MFN prices for patients. And then you have a series of potential regulatory actions that the administration and executive agencies might take if there is that failure to make substantial progress, some of which are already kind of innate legal authority, things like reviewing approvals for drugs that might be unsafe and effective and properly marketed. One might posit presumably would already be happening, but then other ones, right, that have been more daunting. And with some questions, real questions around the legal authority. And then there was a second component, though, that was direct-to-consumer sales, right? Instructing the HHS secretary to facilitate direct-to-consumer purchasing programs to sell drugs to patients at the most favored nation price. As a quick backdrop, this didn't take place in a silo. There was a history leading up to the May executive order, and there also have been further developments since the time of that executive order. In the first Trump administration, there was this, kind of midnight interim final rule that was going to pursue a model, a demonstration in order to test international reference pricing for Part B drugs as of 2021. Unique alliance of manufacturers and also providers very quickly and successfully filed lawsuits enjoining that interim final rule on procedural grounds. They also raised concerns, substantive concerns around the merits, but the courts never reached that. Then you had IRA, negotiation program. And then you have the Trump administration drug pricing executive orders. There was a first executive order in April that really had more of a kind of multifaceted examination of the supply chain, the role of PBMs and others. And then you had this May executive order, which was followed by a press release from HHS in May that gave further color into what the agency views as the most favored nation targets, identified as the lowest price in an OECD country with a per capita GDP of at least 60% of the US GDP. What that means in practice, I think, is still a bit mystifying. How, to figure out what these international prices are alone is a complicated endeavor, if achievable in some circumstances. And then you had July 31st, President Trump sent letters to various manufacturers calling for MFN pricing for every Medicaid patient. Again, it was, the language focused on Medicaid patients. And then also most favored nation commitments for new drugs and discussion around cutting out the middleman, right? Offering direct to patient, simplifying the supply chain if manufacturers commit to the MFN capped prices. So we covered this. The only point I'll make on this slide is there is, I think even within the language of the executive orders, the letters, and other issuances from this administration, different language, at times suggesting we're focused on pricing from the perspective of a patient, in other instances, perhaps suggesting we're looking at pricing from the perspective of a payer. Obviously, a very important distinction, and one that, at least from my perspective, I think I still have some questions regarding what is the specific goal here. So the legal status of the most favored nation executive order, as a quick recap, right, an executive order is a written directive of the president consistent with the president's authority under the US Constitution. Under an executive order, which many administrations have used, the president can direct federal agencies around how to apply existing law, but executive orders do not in and of themselves create new law. Right? Only Congress can do that. And so where agencies are directed through an executive order to take certain follow-on steps, those agency follow-on steps still need to be within the what's supported under the underlying statute. And in terms of whether right now the Medicare and Medicaid statutes do not call for most favored nation pricing, is there a pathway to achieve most favored nation through legal mechanisms? Yes, from my perspective, there are CMMI demonstrations that can be a true test of a payment model. There are certain obligations by statute that apply to CMMI demonstrations, but by statute, you can waive otherwise applicable obligations under the Medicare or Medicaid statute, for instance, revising reimbursement approaches potentially, but all subject to a test and evaluation that then ultimately would require congressional action in order to effect any permanent change in law. So we haven't seen any release yet around an actual CMMI demonstration. Could we see one? Maybe. I think a lot is possible. And I will turn it over to Allison to talk about another late-breaking executive order.
Yes, so you probably maybe saw or heard just last week there was another executive order on a related topic, which is direct-to-consumer advertising. And so last week, on September 9th, there was a new executive order from President Trump directing attention to the need to have more enforcement and some restrictions on DTC advertising for prescription drugs. In tandem, the FDA issued a few things. They initiated rulemaking to potentially close the adequate provision loophole come back to that. They noted that they have an interest in expanding oversight of social media promotion of advertising drugs, sort of closing these digital loopholes, as they are called, and also to commence more aggressive enforcement of DTC violations. At the same time, every marketing authorization holder for a prescription drug got a form letter stating the government's intent to more carefully oversee and commence enforcement for direct-to-consumer prescription drug advertisements. This was a generic sort of template letter, but it did go to every marketing authorization holder. We're pretty sure that was the intent, as we've heard from various of our clients. In addition, there were about 100 cease and desist letters issued to manufacturers who we think there's some other level of review in terms of their current advertising that was found to have some potential issues with it. Those were not letters. What we typically see, like OPDP letters from FDA, kind of with detailed explanation of the potential violations. It was a shorter form, but certainly more than the general letter that went out to all marketing authorization holders. So potentially, the direct-to-patient models we've seen, we'll talk a little bit about some of the variations on the next slide. Many of them do have sort of as a front-end component a direct-to-consumer play, right? Either through a disease awareness initiative by a manufacturer or a direct drug ad that may sort of take you into the pathway where you have an opportunity to make a direct purchase of a drug, for example. We'll see what happens with this DTC executive order and FDA actions. The adequate provision loophole, when you're watching a drug ad and there's the voiceover of the major risks of the drug, and then it points you to a place where you can get the full prescribing information. That's the adequate provision loophole that's being addressed here. Sometimes it's a website, a 1-800 number, like a print ad where you can go get the full safety information. That's been in place for a long time, so we'll sort of see what happens with that from a regulatory and statutory perspective. I think we would all agree that there's been a marked increase, right, in use of social media to have, prescription drug advertising through lots and lots of channels. The concern, I think, expressed in these letters and actions is that a lot of that is happening through influencers or other parties in the market that may not be arguably directly regulated by FDA, and sort of a lot is sort of going through those channels without adequate oversight. FDA certainly hasn't issued a whole lot of guidance on social media. No, not even any final guidance. There's some draft guidance, but there isn't a lot of guidance for manufacturers to follow in this space. So I think that we could certainly expect to see more of. So TBD on this, but definitely sort of an evolving piece of this puzzle. Another piece of this puzzle has been the interest of regulators and Congress. There have been a set of sort of congressional inquiries and this report that was issued just a couple months ago related to their look at a couple specific platforms utilized by two manufacturers, Eli Lilly and Pfizer. And this report, after a series of fact-gathering, really lays out some of the concerns that these particular senators have identified, which we have heard in other places as well, but things like the fact that direct-to-consumer advertising is increasing demand for drugs that may be unnecessary, may be inappropriate for patients, that involving the telehealth component may be really, putting a wrench in the patient-provider relationship, that these telehealth providers aren't establishing enough of a relationship with the patient in order to provide really the right sort of medical and clinical advice and oversight. They are concerns with the high rate of prescriptions that were the conversion rate, so to speak. So the patients that were going through these channels that were facilitated by the manufacturer, in some cases a very high rate, then were converted into a prescription for that manufacturer's drug, something on the order of 75 or 85% in some discrete instances. and some, potential overlap between providers working through the telehealth channel and also maybe that had other relationships with the manufacturer, which it looks like they pulled from open payments data potentially. Sort of concerns about all of these financial relationships as well as concern about the nature of the interaction at base level. So the models that were looked at in that particular congressional report are really one of a lot of different sort of flavors we have seen in this space. Eve and I were sort of trying to figure out kind of how you would even bucket these because they have a lot of different forms and a lot of different sort of collaborations between players at this point. So we have seen collaborations between potentially a telehealth provider, right, the prescribing provider, and a pharmacy. That would be one example. Sometimes there is then the addition of a manufacturer potentially in that collaboration. That is a piece of the model that was looked at in the congressional report. There are also just online pharmacy platforms, right? Like some of the big players in the market are just trying to expand the footprint of online pharmacy. So that is another sort of player in this model. The manufacturer drug discount programs, so perhaps in combination with telehealth, but perhaps just an online discount model without that component, without potentially directing to a pharmacy or not. There are also, as Margot mentioned, an increasing number of vendors in this space that have their own models, for example, like GoodRx, that have in this space contracts and opportunities to offer access to drugs across a wide range of manufacturers. And then, the big retail drug chains and players, for example, Costco, also are potentially entering this market, all with an attempt to have more options, I think, for patients facing the headwinds potentially of, access restrictions, as Margot mentioned. I think some other features we've seen in this space are there are certain types of drugs and therapeutic areas where potentially patients just might be more comfortable with an online interaction and having something delivered directly to their house. We saw, sort of early forays into this with the ED drugs and hair loss and some other things that has certainly now become a feature of the GLP market, the weight loss market. And then, there are the manufacturers trying to get into this space in order to offer additional options.
Okay. So for the next few slides, we're really going to focus on some opportunities and risks when it comes to actually implementing a direct-to-consumer model, whatever form that model may take. So we've seen a lot of activity at the government level. We've seen a lot of activity in the market space. And as everyone has emphasized so far, there's just a multiplicity of models and structures that are being considered and are being implemented. All of those, absent a change in the law, are going to have to fit within an existing regulatory framework. So in the next two slides, the chart that we have up here is really intended to do a couple of things. One is to provide really a checklist for identifying the legal considerations that come into play if you are assessing a particular proposal for a direct-to-consumer model. And then two, provide some guidance that will help you identify where the particular issues are, all of which should ultimately feed into how a particular arrangement is structured. And when the contracts are being put in place to really implement a particular arrangement, what needs to be addressed in those particular contracts and what can be done to mitigate risk across the board. So taking a look on this first slide at some of the key legal considerations, the one thing that I will emphasize is not all of these are going to be implicated by every single direct-to-consumer model, right? So if you have a direct-to-consumer model that doesn't necessarily involve a relationship with a pharmacy, doesn't involve a relationship with a telehealth provider, some of these legal concerns that we're going to be talking about simply aren't going to be there, but a lot of times they will. One that is sort of an ongoing theme would be fraud and abuse laws, right? So if we think of fraud and abuse laws, we typically think of two types of laws that are often implicated. One sort of being the anti-kickback type of laws, which prohibit providing value in exchange for business that is reimbursable under federal healthcare programs and sometimes private insurance. And then two, submitting or causing the submission, right, of a false claim to a federal healthcare program or in some instances private insurance. The typical way to mitigate risk under these types of laws is often to sort of carve out federal healthcare program beneficiaries, right? They simply can't participate. That may not always work if you're talking about a direct-to-consumer model, because the government may have a concern that even if they are purchasing on a cash pay basis or they are not a federal healthcare program beneficiary nowadays, is there a spillover effect in the sense that they may leave the cash pay program and may actually look to access product under insurance programs later. Another thing to keep in mind at the state level is there are a number of laws out there that prohibit certain types of interactions with healthcare providers regardless of who is paying for the healthcare products or services. So those need to be kept in mind. FDA, right? If you think about the advertising, the communications, you have all the standard promotional restrictions to worry about, and then you have this increasingly prevalent emphasis on direct-to-consumer advertising and its implications for creating a need for a particular product, and where is the government going in terms of how that will be regulated, which Allison had just talked about. Consumer protection, I call this like an emerging trend, and not surprising because we're talking about direct-to-consumer models, right? The government has increasingly been using the consumer protection laws as a way to challenge certain direct-to-consumer activities that it feels are inappropriate. And so we're going to see there are currently a couple of either settlement or investigation that look at online telehealth platforms, and they've focused on consumer protection concerns. How are things messaged to consumers? What is happening with consumers' data? And how easy, once a consumer signs up for these programs, is it for the consumer to cancel? Privacy is a big issue. It overlaps with consumer protection to the extent there is a concern about how consumers' information might be used. And the government will go after both claims. There was the GoodRx settlement that focused on violations of consumer protection laws at the federal level on the grounds that consumers using the GoodRx platform were not adequately informed about what would happen with their health data, as well as concerns under the FTC health breach notification rule, because once the data was misused, it was sold to advertisers, that information, that breach was not communicated to consumers. So on the next slide, we'll see it just doesn't stop, right? When you think about going through the checklist, and I've got another slide after this. This is something, and you can't just ignore some of these issues. Government price reporting, this I will defer to Margot. She's going to talk about this to a greater degree, but a big issue is what impact is this going to have when it comes on these models, and how do you structure them appropriately to ensure there are no unexpected adverse government price reporting concerns. Issues with professional clinical licensure, telehealth licensing. All of the prescribers need to be appropriately licensed, and in some cases, if they're a telehealth provider, that means a specific type of a license. One of the ongoing government investigations on Dun Global is actually focusing on, or there's an allegation that prescribers were writing prescriptions, for patients where they were not, adequately licensed in a particular jurisdiction. And so that's a key concern, particularly in the telehealth space. Also, corporate practice of medicine. All the arrangements we're seeing now are there's a certain separation, right, between the manufacturer or the other party and the actual healthcare professionals that are prescribing the product, because many states will limit the ability of third parties to employ physicians. So that's often done on a contractual basis, but it's something to keep in mind. On the next slide, pharmacy licensure is also an issue, right? So in these national programs that are looking to serve patients across the country, making sure the pharmacy is appropriately licensed to fill scripts is a legal issue. It's also a business issue, right, in terms of selecting the partners. And that's actually a recurring thing. Some of these considerations of your manufacturer, they're not going to implicate you directly. They're going to implicate the entities you choose to partner with. And so it's very important to know who you're partnering with, know that they know what the laws are, and that they have appropriately structured their own operations before you end up contracting with them. Controlled substances laws. This, I think, having controlled substances in the mix really increases the overall risk profile of any particular proposal. Where the government has gone after, most recently, some of the big online telehealth platforms that allow access to drugs, it's been in situations where there are, controlled substances at play, right? The Dun Global situation that I mentioned, as well as the Cerebral settlement. And then finally, allocation of liability. There's going to be liability in the mix. From a contractual perspective, make sure it's allocated appropriately. I cannot tell you the number of times you see a vendor contract where all the reps are, the responsibility is on the manufacturer to make sure everything is done right, and then the vendor is indemnified for everything, right? And they can do no wrong. So be very careful on what is in the contract and that everything lines up. We're not going to talk about all of the specific legal, sort of issues that I just ran through. I do want to pause a little bit and focus just on fraud and abuse, because unlike where we've seen the change on the sort of the FTC and direct-to-consumer advertising and some of the other particular issues that have been at play, there hasn't necessarily been a lot of brand new guidance in the fraud and abuse space. So you're looking to apply existing guidance out there to these new direct-to-consumer patient models. What you do have, I think, is sort of this sense that where the government is focused on issues from a fraud and abuse perspective, there is a concern about deceptive consumer-directed, marketing, bringing the, patient in, encouraging them to use a product based on deceptive advertising. There's a concern about limited interaction between the prescriber and the patient. How can there be certain that the products being prescribed are medically necessary, the products the government is paying for, right? So there's that lack of medical necessity concern. And then also financial incentives to order or prescribe specific care. This is not something that is necessarily limited to situations where the care being ordered is a drug, right? You have a history of the government going after telehealth providers. I provide an example here, the Operation Double Helix, where they went after, laboratories, physicians, telehealth companies in situations where, Medicare beneficiaries through advertising, health fairs, et cetera, were allegedly, being encouraged to try to have certain genetic tests to identify cancer ordered on their behalf, and then claims were submitted to the government, right? That's not in the drug space, but it exemplifies some of the concerns the government has. In those situations, sometimes the test results weren't even provided back, right? And the government, paid significant amounts of money for that. Another sort of helpful guidance document is the alert, special fraud alert that went out in, I think, 2022. And that talks about concerns about, in the telehealth space. Interestingly enough, the title suggests it's sort of a cautionary note to physicians to be careful like what you're doing. And here are the fraud and abuse concerns in the telehealth space. And so none of these are going to be new because Allison and Margot and I have already been talking about them, right? Concerns about how patients are identified. Are they recruited by advertising that focuses on free, low out-of-pocket costs? Is there enough interaction with the prescribing practitioner to know that the care is medically necessary? And then how is the practitioner compensated? That's a big fraud and abuse issue, and it comes up over and over again in the ongoing investigations that their judgment might be compromised based on how they're being compensated. And then is there a situation where what the telehealth company does is so narrow in terms of what they will be prescribed or the type of care that they will order that you can't be certain that they are really prescribing or ordering, the best care for the patient based on the patient's particular needs. And this is a situation where if there is a need for a follow-up care, they're not going to get it from the telehealth company is another concern that the government has in this particular situation. Interestingly enough, the congressional report that Allison had talked about gives a nod to this particular OIG guidance, right? So you sort of have these recurring themes and these cross-references coming up. On the next slide, I just want to highlight, again, not a perfect roadmap for how to structure things, but there are two advisory opinions out there that focus on discounted offerings to patients, both of which operate outside of insurance. They're sort of cash pay situations, and they are very narrow. In one case, the product was excluded from coverage under Medicare. In another, it had very, very limited Medicare coverage, right? So we're not talking about the broad-based offerings that we see today, which sort of limits how you can use it as a roadmap. But still, there are some considerations that do come into play. So these are situations where the government felt comfortable because there was limited or no Medicare coverage. And not all of these are both the advisory opinions, but something to think about. If the patients wanted to switch, they could do so easily. They weren't sort of trapped in this because they'd initiate a particular therapy. They would, in some instances, identify, what prescription coverage the patient had, and if it was a certain type of coverage, they might not be able to participate as federal health care program beneficiaries outside of Medicare Part D. If they were Medicare Part D patients, then there were additional sort of safeguards that came into play, right? Letting the plan know that the patient was receiving a discount sort of outside of the coverage, and sharing information with CMS. And also, these were situations where it wasn't limited time. The patients could enroll, and the programs would go on for a long period of time, the government being concerned that they might flip out and then get coverage outside of the cash pay program.
And then we have government price reporting. So, as we all know, you filter and look at all of your sales, and determine what is the appropriate treatment. Under the Medicaid statute, patients are not defined as an eligible purchaser, and CMS has codified regulations for AMP and best price that exclude from your MDRP reporting, quote, direct sales to patients. So we have that available regulatory exception. I will say that is not the end of the inquiry necessarily. I think in many instances, direct-to-patient is is an alternative channel, right? It's not the only channel. If you think about many patients with chronic disease, you think about patients who need specialty therapies, even if there were a direct-to-patient channel that were made available, even if a manufacturer said, I want to make lower prices available, the reality for many patients is that amount still might not be affordable on a cash pay basis. And so in general, if you have a direct-to-patient model, but that's one component and you have other sales, it's important to look at the overall picture, look at the entities that are involved. Are there other arrangements, remuneration, and how do you take those into account in your government price reporting? I think these structures, as we've discussed, can be complicated, and so it's important to sit down, look at the contracts, try to understand your vendors and how these models operate, and then, do as best as you can to work through that with legal counsel, and then ultimately best practice is document, right, your understanding of what the government price reporting treatment is and what is appropriate. We know also that CMS has, in preamble, discussed some interaction between direct-to-patient sales and the free good, right, exception, and so important to take that into account as well. If this is a direct-to-patient sale and it's also free, there might be more layers to the analysis that are worth, unpacking and thinking through together with your legal counsel.
So just a quick note here, we've already talked about some of the FDA restrictions, but there are various sort of channels for sort of potential enforcement and regulation here, including both the FDA and FTC. The FDA requirements for drug advertisement are here on the bottom, which are very relevant to the executive order and those actions we talked about earlier. But notably, Eve mentioned a couple of the recent enforcement actions involving telehealth or these models sort of in this vein that also involved FTC. So they have been active in this space where there is a consumer protection or a data privacy or security potential overlay, including Cerebral and GoodRx. Of course, we have FDA involvement as well if the sort of front door in the model is DTC, and then as Eve mentioned, those various other laws such as state consumer protection. So in terms of practical considerations, what to think about if this is a model you're thinking about, a model you're exploring, as we've made, I think, very clear at this point, there are lots of different iterations of the model involving different players and different combinations of the players. But in terms of principles to think about, right, is this an appropriate model for this particular therapeutic area, this particular drug? Is there a, administration challenges, a safety profile such that this may not be appropriate? I think is certainly something to think about. We've seen a lot of these models be used on more sort of lifestyle type drugs, for example, at least at the outset, or drugs, where there is already a lot of proliferation of generics. They've been on the market a long time, for example, derm topical drugs, things like that. Certainly, the access challenge, right, is prevalent across all of these models. We've seen that across the entire industry, but important to make sure that you are preserving both the provider-patient relationship in whatever the model is, and making sure that the patient, to the extent possible, maintain some choice, both in the therapy and how they will receive it, right? What pharmacy or what other method. Other thoughts, Eve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that feeds into absolutely in the consumer interactions, that focus on consumer understanding. Do they understand what they are signing up for and what their options are and what the implications of that are, as well as consumer flexibility, right? So you want to make sure that, all the terms and conditions are clear, readily accessible. They know if they're getting copay assistance versus getting a discount drug. The messaging shouldn't suggest that this is an easy way to access, prescription drugs, that they just have to raise their hand and they're going to get their drug of choice. The messaging should be on the, sort of additional, that this is an additional option to seeking a diagnosis or obtaining access to medically necessary care. To Allison's point, you don't want to interfere with the physician-patient relationships, right? And then also, understand what it means, right? If you're purchasing outside of insurance, that means you're never spending down your deductible, and there may be implications associated with that. And then also from consumer messaging or consumer offers, not including financial incentives to use this particular pathway potentially to access care. And then sort of what are the other options the patient has available to them in order to access care. So again, preserving patient choice.
Okay, so what are some other practical steps? If you are entering into one of these arrangements, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to conduct diligence, know your vendor, understand their model, ask questions. You might be asking questions that they haven't thought of in quite that way before. And I think the government price reporting lens of looking at things can be distinct in that regard, right? Certain things really matter to us in the GP world that might not stick out to other individuals as relevant. I would say beyond just that initial level of diligence, I would suggest really examining what are these transactions going to look like when they come through? How are you going to filter them? How are you going to identify them? What are they mapped onto in terms of class of trade? Do you have patients in your class of trade schema and matrix? I think there's a lot of devil in the details where you could have really thoughtful upfront work, right? And paper your contracts, and then suddenly you start looking at the transactions and they come through and there can be confusion. And so ensuring that there is as seamless as possible a journey from what the parties have agreed, whatever you memorialize in the contract, your oversight of the vendor, but also what you're going to see when the data starts flowing in. I would consider other items, right? If you have a standard form invoice, what does this look like? What goes out in the documentation around the transaction? Because again, you can work with your legal counsel and paper things as beautifully as you can and consistent with the party's intent, right? But ultimately, if you have a standard form invoice and template that's going to include language that is going to create questions or confusion, just try to identify those things early on across the entire journey so that you have as seamless a process as possible, even from GP implementation. Consider this in the context of your broader market access arrangements, right? This is a non-traditional supply chain agreement. Think through, how does this implicate your other agreements, the other channels, and then, define expectations and allocate responsibility appropriately. We talked about this before. Look at the indemnification obligations, but I also would look at things like audit rights. How much visibility are you going to have into what's actually taking place in the model? Completely agree that I've seen in many of the contracts, many of the vendors say, ultimately, it's the manufacturer's responsibility. Well, do you have access to all of the information that you need in order to oversee what's actually taking place and feel comfortable that it's consistent with your expectations? I don't know, even Allison on telehealth, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, we've noted some things here to think about we've seen in some of these contracts, but I think it sort of goes back to making sure you have adequate representations from your vendor, particularly if it's a vendor in a space where you don't operate, right? Like a clinical provider providing telehealth services. There are various laws, state laws on telehealth services, privacy laws, licensing, accreditation, other requirements that really do need to be the responsibility of the telehealth provider, but you also need to have some confidence, right, that they're going to exercise those appropriately, so.
And the other point that I would just make is when you think about oversight and audit rights, the sort of independent decision-making of the telehealth provider is one place where you do need to be hands-off. I think this has been like a focus, right? The extent to which, manufacturer, other third party might have, oversight, might have input into clinical protocols and things like that, and that is definitely a hands-off situation.
And then, internally align with others. There are many different stakeholders internally who would play an important role in affecting a direct-to-patient model. GP is very important to have at the table. Again, right, the GP team will see and think of different things that others might not think of, but you also need legal in the room, market access in the room, obviously senior leadership, compliance, and others. And so, if you're hearing discussions around exploring these models, encourage each of you to raise your hand and look around the room and say, who is not here who needs to be a part of this discussion, so we can all align and make sure that we agree on the approach. And I know that we are over time. If we can take a couple questions, we're happy to do so. If we need to wrap up, we'll also be here if anybody wants to come up afterwards. Maybe we'll take a minute or two in case there are any questions. Nobody's kicking us off the stage, so. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.